Why did you decide to pursue classical singing?
Well, when I was growing up, when I was a child, my mother had a collection of records of musicals, and I just loved to listen to them. And when I was about 6, she took me to see Julie Andrews in the original My Fair Lady. And I just loved the way she sounded. And so I would just walk around the house singing songs from My Fair Lady, trying to sound like Julie Andrews. And I like that pretty sound. Now, I wouldn't really call it a classical sound, but it's what Broadway people call legit. So I think my voice started off on the right track because that was the sound I was trying to imitate rather than some kind of pop sound that would be in a low range. And then I graduated from musicals to listening to Gilbert and Sullivan and learning all the soprano arias, songs from Gilbert and Sullivan. It wasn't until much later that I really sang classical music, as in the sense of opera. So I was much older then. But I liked that kind of a sound. I didn't like making what I thought of as ugly sounds to sing rock and roll or pop, although I did listen to a lot of that when I was a teenager.
What were some of the roadblocks you encountered as an LGBTQ person involved in classical singing?
Well, when I really got serious about classical singing, I was in my mid-20s. And at that time, I was newly in love. I was involved in a relationship with Betty, the woman I would be with for 44 years. And that was the most important thing in my life. And I did begin, again, serious classical singing, or really serious for the first time, singing in an oratorio. It was a women's oratorio. It was written for 3 women's voice ranges as a chorus, and there were several soloists. So I sang the part of Sleeping Beauty, which totally suited me, because this was a chorus of mostly lesbians, and I was pretty much the only femme, and they cast me as Sleeping Beauty. Then, of course, because I did have a good voice teacher, I wanted to move on and learn some opera roles. I already had a basic vocal technique. So because I was sort of in between a soprano and a mezzo. Now, a mezzo is a lower women's classical voice range, but a mezzo is still singing higher than a non-classical singer. So as sort of this in-betweeny voice type, I was mostly, when I was cast in an opera, playing a boy. And you have to imagine that I was not only 15 pounds thinner, I was also 5 inches taller. So I was very believable as a boy. That was a tradition that originated with castrati, who were castrated boys who then grew up. This was in Italy in the 1700s, maybe early 1800s, and then they grew up to have the range of a soprano and the vocal power of a man. So that's who a lot of these roles were written for, and then it just became a tradition. So I did a lot of that. But as I progressed from playing boys to playing female parts, particularly if there was a love scene with a man involved, my partner, Betty, was very jealous, very angry, and gave me a very hard time about it. And I suppose I really got flack from both sides. I was given to understand, this was 1977, 78, maybe up until 1980 or 81. I was given to understand that if I wanted to do anything serious in the world of classical singing, at the time I was just singing with amateur opera groups, that it would behoove me to be in the closet. Now, there were several other gay women who sang opera, and people who knew them, of course, knew that they were gay, but it was not part of their public persona. So this was a message that I got from the world of classical singing. And then from my lesbian community, I got a message that, why are you investing yourself in a patriarchal art form like opera? It was very disparaging. So if you added to that I wasn't making any money and I needed to focus on other things, eventually I gave up singing when I was about 30, 31, because I was never going to sing casually or informally. If I wasn't going to train and be serious about it, I just wasn't going to do it. So I was going to focus on other things like my job and education.
When and why did you start singing again?
Forgot about singing, and one indication of that was I was always dreaming about singing, and every now and then I would sing for my own amusement, entertainment. If there was a karaoke, I would pick some legit musical theater song that I could sing that was in a high range, and every now and then I picked up an aria and sang through it. I have no idea why. I didn't study, and I wasn't serious about it. And it certainly wasn't a focus of my attention, but it was something that was always there, nagging at me. Then in 2002, so at that point I would have been 52, I saw an issue of Opera News, and there was a story about Patricia Rissette. She was a soprano. I think she's mostly retired now, but she was a soprano who sang at the Met. And in this interview in Opera News, she talked about her female partner, just the way other opera singers in these types of interviews would talk about their husband or their wife of an opposite gender. And it was very low stress, matter of fact. And she looked just like an ordinary woman. I guess what they would call today an ordinary cisgender woman who played female roles. She played love scenes with men. She had a female partner. Nobody seemed to care. In other words, her singing colleagues didn't seem to care that she was a lesbian. And her partner didn't care that she was playing love scenes with men. So there seemed to be a lot less anger and a lot less stress around all of this from all sides. So I didn't start singing again for another 2 years. And I didn't just start singing again because I read that article, but I think that was sort of the groundwork that made me think maybe this is something I can do, because the landscape has changed. So I started going to church with my partner Betty. And in church, there are hymnals, and even if you're just sitting in the pews, you sing. So I opened my mouth and started singing. And I actually sounded better than I had 30 years earlier, or not 30, I would say 23 or 4 years earlier when I had stopped. And I was discovered, I guess you would say sort of like Lana Turner. There was a man in the congregation who was a voice teacher, and he came up and started talking to me and asked me if I was a professional singer. So I said no, but I said that I had sung with some amateur opera groups a very long time ago. And so that's how things got started again. But sadly, no matter how well I sang, I was much too old to be competitive. And the standards had risen greatly. When I was singing amateur opera, these were groups that were for amateurs. And the standard, they weren't looking for someone who was going to audition for the Met next year. They were like community theater that were on that level. Now, there were no amateur opera groups that would want someone like me who didn't have a conservatory degree or anything on a resume. So I decided I would primarily sing church solos, which used the same technique that I had singing opera, but it was much less strenuous and less competitive. And then occasionally, if I wanted to, I could throw together some concert version of an opera to sing in a nursing home. But that was, and I've been singing ever since. I'm now almost 74. And because I've been studying and practicing and working and training, amazingly, I sound better than I did at 54, which is when I started. And certainly than I did when I was 30.
How had the landscape changed 25 years on?
Well, it hadn't just changed in terms of classical singing. It had changed in very many ways. First of all, there's much less social homophobia, at least in the circles in which I would be moving, certainly the circles where people are involved in the arts. I don't think by 2004, yes, marriage was not yet legal, but most people didn't care if you had a same-sex partner, as I said, in the circles in which I moved. And there was much less closeting. And as sort of the mirror image of that, the lesbian community, I'm using that term because I'm talking specifically about women, was much more diverse in terms of appearance, clothing, hairstyles, social life. The lesbian community, or I should say the uncloseted lesbian community in the 70s when I was trying to sing, was very monolithic. How people dressed, how they looked, what they thought was an acceptable way to spend your time or your money, or the kinds of people you should and shouldn't socialize with, straight men being at the top of the list of people you shouldn't socialize with. And everything was just more relaxed 25 years on both ends, both in terms of acceptance of LGBTQ people by the straight community and acceptance of sort of sartorial and social diversity by the lesbian community. And there was a lot less anger in the lesbian community than there had been in the 70s. And of course that was reflected in the world of classical singing, because there were not just Patricia Rissette, but 5 or 6 women who were public figures in the opera world who were very open about their same-sex relationships and who looked just like anybody else. I guess the term would be cisgender.
Are you still singing now?
As I said, yes, I'm still singing now. I had to give up a lot of my aspirations. This was very, very hard. I have not stressed how hard it was, that by the time I felt I really sounded good and had some self-confidence, I was too old, and as someone with no conservatory credentials and no network, I was not relevant in that world in any way. And it was very, very hard. But I just decided I'm going to take this as far as it'll go. So if I can still keep getting stronger and singing better and sounding better and training, I'm going to keep doing this for as long as I possibly can. And I can make my own little world. I can sing solos in a church. I can put on recitals in a senior center where the audience is already there, so I don't have to feel hurt that people don't come. And I can just do it for itself. I don't go to the opera very much. Makes me too sad. So I go to the ballet and I go to plays and I go to chamber music concerts. And I discovered that I feel better and sing better if I mostly mind my own business. And I have found a lot of support. Not where I thought I would find it, not that much from other classical singers, mostly from other women my age who have taken up activities, whether it's writing, whether it's painting, whether it's relearning the piano. So that's my community of support.